On a Tuesday morning in September 2003, three boys sat on the steps of a public library in Millhaven, Ohio. The oldest was 14. The middle one was 12. The youngest had just turned 10 2 weeks before, and nobody had remembered his birthday. They had one backpack between them. Inside it, 2 cans of baked beans with no opener, a photograph with a cracked frame, and a folded piece of paper with an address on it that turned out, when they finally found it, to belong to a building that had been demolished 6 months earlier. They had been sitting on those steps for 11 hours. They had nowhere to go. Nobody in that town knew who they were. Nobody stopped to ask. People walked past them the way people walk past things that make them uncomfortable, quickly, with their eyes slightly averted, with the practiced unseeing of people who have decided, without quite deciding, that whatever that situation is, it is not their situation to fix. Nobody stopped. Except one woman. She came out of the library at 6:43 p.m. with a stack of books under one arm and a canvas bag in the other hand. She was 61 years old. She lived alone. She had no children of her own, no husband, no family within 400 miles, and a 2-bedroom house on the edge of town that most people in Millhaven described, when they described it at all, as that old place by the creek. She stopped in front of those 3 boys and looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, "When did you last eat?" The youngest one, the one whose birthday nobody had remembered, looked up at her. "Yesterday," he said. She nodded once, like this was information she had been given and had now filed and would act on. "Come on then," she said. And that was the beginning. What those 3 boys did when they came back to Millhaven 22 years later did not just shock the town, it rearranged it. This is the full story, from the very beginning. Grab a drink and sit back. Don't forget to subscribe to SOC Chronicles and share with your friends and families. To understand what those boys lost, you need to understand what they had. And what they had, before the unraveling, was extraordinary. Their father was a man named Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore was, by any measure, one of the most self-made men in the state of Ohio. Born in 1951 to a coal miner father and a seamstress mother in a 3-room house in eastern Kentucky, Gerald had grown up with the specific bone-deep understanding of poverty that never quite leaves a person, the kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning decades later, even when you're sleeping in a house worth $4 million, with the irrational conviction that it could all disappear by morning. That fear had not paralyzed him, it had propelled him. By the time he was 30, he had built a regional construction company from a single truck, and a loan he wasn't entirely sure he could repay. By 40, Whitmore Construction was operating across 6 states with contracts in commercial development, infrastructure, and government projects. By 50, Gerald Whitmore was worth an estimated $68 million and had been featured in 3 separate magazine profiles about self-made American wealth. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man transformed by money into something unrecognizable. He still called his childhood friends, he still drove himself to work 3 days a week. He still remembered, with specificity, what it felt like to not have enough, and this memory made him, in the main, generous. Not performatively generous, quietly generous. The kind that doesn't need an audience. He met Eleanor Chen at a charity dinner in 1986. She was 32, a pediatric nurse with a laugh that people in the room kept turning toward. He was 35 and had been, up until that evening, entirely convinced that he was too busy and too focused to fall in love with anyone. He was wrong about that. They were married within a year, and the life they built together in a large, warm house in Millhaven, Ohio, which Gerald had chosen because it reminded him, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, of the small-town values he'd grown up with, was by every account a genuinely good one. Not perfect, not without its arguments and its pressures and the particular strains that come with significant wealth and the people it attracts, but good, rooted, real. They had 3 sons. James was born in 1989. From the time he could walk, he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and a quality of stillness that made adults in the room instinctively pay attention to him. He was the kind of child who listened before he spoke, and who, when he did speak, made you feel that what he said had been carefully considered. Robert came 2 years later, in 1991. Where James was still, Robert was motion, always moving, always building something, always taking things apart to see how they worked, and then usually putting them back together in a configuration that worked better. He was his father's favorite in the way that parents with multiple children have one child who reflects something specific back at them, not more loved, but more recognized. And then there was Thomas. Thomas was born in 1993, the youngest by 2 years, and he arrived in the world with a quality that his mother described from the time he was an infant as fully present. He felt everything, not in a fragile way, in a receiving way, like an antenna tuned to a frequency that other people couldn't quite pick up. He cried at music, he made friends with every animal he encountered. He remembered with startling accuracy things people had said to him years before, not because he was trying to remember, but because he had been paying attention in a way that meant the things simply stayed. The three of them grew up in that large house in Millhaven with a sense of security so deep and so assumed that they would not fully understand what they had until the precise terrible moment it was taken from them. Eleanor Whitmore was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor in January 2000. She died 14 months later, in March 2001. James was 12, Robert was 10, Thomas was 8. Gerald Whitmore's grief was the kind that changes the architecture of a person. He functioned. He continued to run the company, to attend his son's school events, to maintain the routines that Eleanor had established, because those routines were all he had left of the shape she had given their life. But the people closest to him, his business partner David Kim, his sister Lorraine, and his oldest friend Marcus Webb, saw the change and described it the same way. Like a building where the central support beam had been removed, still standing, but differently. He became, in his grief, vulnerable in a way he had never been before. This is not a criticism, it is simply a fact about human beings, that loss, genuine and catastrophic loss, opens doors in us that were previously locked. Sometimes what comes through those doors is grace. Sometimes it is something else entirely. What came through Gerald Whitmore's door had a name. Her name was Vivienne Marsh. She had been hired as a live-in housekeeper 6 months after Eleanor died. She came with good references that would later be investigated and found to be not fabricated exactly, but significantly embellished. She was 34 years old, attractive, efficient, and possessed of a quality that people in retrospect described differently depending on how charitable they were feeling. Some called it warmth, some called it calculation, and the others, the ones who had seen it up close, called it performance. What she performed in the 2 years after she arrived in the Whitmore household was the role of a woman falling genuinely and helplessly in love with a grieving widower. Gerald Whitmore was 50 years old, alone, and had spent his entire adult life being the person who saw through things. He had built a $68 million company on his ability to read people and situations accurately. He had survived decades of business negotiation and partnership and competition with his instincts intact. He did not see through Vivienne Marsh. He married her in June 2003. James was 14, Robert was 12, Thomas was 8. The boys had not been asked.
James Whitmore, who at 14 was already the still, observant young man he had been as a child, knew something was wrong within the first 3 months of Vivienne's arrival. He could not have told you specifically what he knew or how he knew it. It was the accumulation of small things, the way her face rearranged itself when his father left the room, the questions she asked about the company that seemed slightly too specific for someone with no stated business interest, the way she touched things in the house as if she were taking an inventory, the way she looked at him and his brothers sometimes, not with hostility, but with something that felt, when he tried to find the right word for it, like calculation. He told his father once. Gerald Whitmore looked at his oldest son with an expression that James would carry with him for 20 years. Not angry, not dismissive,
but the expression of a man who has decided, in some deep and protected place, that he needs this particular thing to be real, and who therefore cannot afford to hear what his son is telling him. "She's been good to us, James," he said. "Give her a chance." James said nothing more after that. He was 14, and he understood, with the particular clarity of children who have learned to read adults carefully, that there were moments when saying the right thing did more damage than saying nothing. He watched instead. What he watched over the following 2 years was Vivienne Marsh, now Vivienne Whitmore, systematically and methodically building a structure around his father. It was done with patience and intelligence. She isolated him gradually from the people closest to him, not dramatically, not with scenes or ultimatums, but with the slow, almost imperceptible technique of someone who understands that a man can be moved enormous distances if each individual step is small enough that he doesn't notice he is moving. David Kim, the business partner of 20 years, found himself gradually excluded from key meetings. Gerald's sister Lorraine found her calls going unreturned. Marcus Webb, the oldest friend, the man who had known Gerald since they were young men with nothing, found himself, over the course of about 18 months, simply no longer part of the life he had always been part of. And through all of this, Vivienne was working on something else. She was working on the paperwork. The full picture of what she did would not emerge until much later. What emerged eventually, through the investigation that came after, was this. Over a period of approximately 2 years, using her access to Gerald's personal documents and her growing influence over his daily decisions, Vivienne had orchestrated a gradual transfer of assets. Property deeds, investment accounts, business interests held in personal rather than corporate names. It was done piece by piece, through documents presented to Gerald in moments carefully chosen for maximum distraction, during stressful business periods, during the anniversaries of Eleanor's death, during the particular emotional openness that follows an argument and a reconciliation. Gerald Whitmore, who had built $68 million from nothing on the strength of his judgment, signed things he should not have signed. By early 2003, a significant portion of the personal assets that had been in Gerald's name were in Vivienne's name instead. Then, on August 14, 2003, Gerald Whitmore died. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He was 52 years old and had no prior history of significant heart disease. The death was ruled natural. There was no investigation, not immediately, not in the way there should have been. He was a wealthy man who had died suddenly, and his wife was present and grieving, and the paperwork was in order. It was only later, much later, that certain people began to ask certain questions about the medication that had been found in Gerald's system. Questions that, when they were finally asked properly, would produce answers that nobody in Millhaven was prepared for. But that is the end of the story. We are still at the beginning. Vivienne Whitmore moved with a speed that, in retrospect, confirmed everything James had suspected for 2 years. Within 3 weeks of Gerald's death, she had presented the family's attorney with documents establishing her as the primary beneficiary and sole executor of the estate. The attorney, an older man who had served the Whitmore family for 15 years, raised objections. He was replaced within the month by a firm Vivienne had selected herself. Within 6 weeks, the large house in Millhaven that Gerald had chosen because it reminded him of the values he'd grown up with was being redecorated. Eleanor's things, the photographs, the small ceramic pieces she had collected, the books with her handwriting in the margins, were boxed and put in storage without the boys being consulted. And within 8 weeks of their father's death, James, Robert, and Thomas Whitmore were told by Vivienne in the kitchen of the house their father had built that arrangements had been made for them. The arrangements were a boarding school in upstate New York that, when James later investigated it, turned out to be a facility of notably poor reputation. Not a school for ambitious children from wealthy families, but a facility that functioned primarily as a repository for children that someone wanted out of the way. James refused. He was 14 years old, and he looked at the woman who had destroyed his family, and he said, with a steadiness that came from somewhere deeper than his age, "That is not what our father wanted for us, and you know it." Vivienne looked at him with the expression he had seen her use when she thought nobody important was watching, the expression beneath the performance. "Your father," she said, "is not here to want anything." The three boys were given 48 hours to pack what they could carry. What James packed, a change of clothes for each of them, the family photograph with the cracked frame, the one from Christmas 1999, the last Christmas their mother was healthy, and a piece of paper on which their father's sister Lorraine had written her address 2 years ago, before Vivienne had cut her off. What Robert packed were his tools, a small roll of basic hand tools he had accumulated since he was 8 years old, because Robert believed, in the practical and unshakable way he believed most things, that a person who could fix things could survive anything. What Thomas packed was his mother's Bible, and a notebook in which he had been writing since Eleanor died, a record of things he did not want to forget. His mother's laugh, the way his father looked when he came home from work, the smell of the kitchen on Saturdays. He was 10 years old. He had already understood, with the antenna of his extraordinary emotional receptivity, that the things that matter most are the ones that disappear without warning. They left on a Thursday morning with one backpack between them. James insisted they consolidate, and made their way towards Aunt Lorraine's address. Aunt Lorraine had moved. The building had been demolished. They sat on the steps of the Millhaven Public Library for 11 hours, until a woman came out with a stack of books under her arm and stopped.
The story is getting deeper and hotter at this point. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to our channel. Don't also forget that there are more exciting stories on our channel to enjoy. Her name was Ruby Mae Collins. She had been born in 1942 in rural Mississippi, the 7th of 9 children, in a community where Black families had been surviving on ingenuity and mutual support, and the particular iron-spined dignity of people who have learned that the world will not make space for them, so they must make it themselves. She had come north to Ohio in 1965, at 23, with a nursing qualification, $40, and a certainty about herself that people who met her described, regardless of how they felt about everything else, as the most solid thing in any room she walked into. She had worked as a nurse for 31 years. She had never married, not for lack of offers, but because she had decided, somewhere in her 30s, that the right person had not appeared, and she was not going to arrange her life around an absence. She had her work, she had her garden, she had her library, she had her faith, which was the practical, unsentimentally demanding kind, the kind that did not ask you to feel good, but asked you to do right. She had retired in 1998 and settled into the 2-bedroom house by the creek that she had bought in 1979 and paid off in 1991, and which contained by 2003 30 years of accumulated life, books on every surface, a vegetable garden that her neighbors quietly regarded as the best in the county, a sewing machine that had been her mother's, and a profound and settled peace that came from a person who has figured out who they are and has stopped arguing with it. She had no children of her own. This was not, she had long ago decided, a wound. It was simply the shape her life had taken. She had raised, in various ways and to various degrees, the children of 4 different neighbors over the years, taking them in after school, feeding them, talking to them, being the stable presence in their lives when other presences were unstable. She was not looking for children. She was also not the kind of woman who walked past 3 hungry boys on library steps and told herself it was not her situation to fix. When she brought them home that Thursday evening and made them rice and stew and watched them eat with the focused, wordless intensity of children who are genuinely hungry, she did not ask them a single question about where they had come from or what had happened. She fed them first. Then she showed them where the bathroom was. Then she made up the 2nd bedroom. She had 2 single beds and a folding cot, and she said, "You sleep. We talk tomorrow." James looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Ruby looked back at him with the expression of a woman for whom this question did not require much thought. "Because you needed somewhere to be," she said, "and I have somewhere." She turned off the light. What Ruby Collins gave those 3 boys was not simple. It would be easy and inaccurate to describe it as charity. Ruby did not believe in charity in the passive sense. She believed in investment.
She believed that a person given something without expectation learned dependency, and that a person given something with clear and loving expectation learned capability. There was a difference, and she had thought about it carefully for 61 years, and she knew which one she was offering. The first thing she gave them was structure. Within 2 weeks of their arrival, the house on the creek operated on a schedule. Everyone was up by 6. The house had responsibilities. Cooking rotated, cleaning was divided, the garden was tended. Not as punishment, as participation. Ruby's position was simple. This is a household, not a hotel, and you are members of it, not guests. Robert, who had always needed his hands to be doing something, took to the garden with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. Within a month, he had reorganized Ruby's planting schedule in a way that she observed with quiet satisfaction and said nothing about for 3 weeks before telling him, "You have a good mind for systems." He remembered those words for the rest of his life. Thomas, who felt everything, needed the most careful handling in those early months. He had nightmares. He would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, and Ruby, who had always slept lightly, would be in the kitchen when he came downstairs, with tea already made, as if she had known. She never made a performance of it, she simply sat with him. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but the message was always the same, delivered not in words, but in the simple fact of her presence. You are not alone. Whatever is happening inside you is not too much. I am here. James was the hardest. James had been the oldest. He had been the one who watched what happened to his family and could not stop it. He had been responsible for getting his brothers out, for finding Aunt Lorraine's address, for making the decisions when there was nobody else to make them. He had carried this, was still carrying it, in the way that oldest children in crisis carry things, silently, with a rigidity in the jaw and a watchfulness in the eyes that looked like strength, and was also, underneath, the posture of someone bracing for the next blow. Ruby did not try to dismantle this directly. She was too wise for that. What she did instead was give him responsibility, real responsibility. She involved him in decisions about the household. She asked his opinion and took it seriously. She treated him not as a child to be fixed, but as a young person whose judgment was worth consulting. And slowly, over months, she watched the rigidity in his jaw ease by degrees, because the thing that makes a person rigid is usually the sense that they are holding something alone, and James was no longer holding it alone. She enrolled them in Millhaven public schools within the first month. This required conversations with the school district that Ruby navigated with the combination of charm and immovable determination that was her particular gift. There were questions about guardianship, about documentation, about the formal status of 3 boys whose legal situation was, to put it kindly, complicated. Ruby answered every question with patience, and then did what she needed to do to get those boys in a classroom. She also hired an attorney. Her name was Patricia Ossie, a black woman in her 40s who practiced family and estate law in Columbus, and who, when Ruby laid out the situation, set down her pen and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Patricia Ossie would become important later, very important, but we are still in the early years. Ruby Collins was not a woman who believed that education was only what happened in classrooms. She believed that a person needed 3 things to survive and thrive in the world. They needed to be able to think clearly, they needed to know who they were, and they needed to understand that they were connected to something larger than themselves. Everything else, the credentials, the careers, the money, was downstream of these 3 things. Get the 3 things right, and the rest had a way of following. Get them wrong or skip them, and no amount of downstream success would fill the gap. So she taught them to think. Every evening after dinner, Ruby conducted what she called, without irony, without self-consciousness, the table. It was not formal, it was simply a conversation. She would raise a topic, something from the news, something from history, something she had read that day, and she would ask each of the boys what they thought. Not what the right answer was, what they thought. And then she would push, gently, precisely, with the skill of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching patients how to understand their own conditions. Why do you think that? What would happen if the opposite were true? Who benefits from people believing what you just said? James became, over years of this, a thinker of extraordinary precision. He could locate the weak point in any argument within minutes. He could see almost immediately what any given situation was actually about underneath what it appeared to be about. This was the mind he had always had. Ruby simply gave it the tools it needed. Robert became an engineer. Not yet officially, not yet with credentials, but in every sense that mattered. Ruby had books on engineering, on architecture, on systems design, and Robert consumed them with the appetite of someone who has finally found the language that matches the way his brain already works. He built things constantly, fixed things, redesigned things, improved things around the house with a competence that grew so steadily that by the time he was 15, the neighbors had started bringing their broken appliances to the house on the creek. Thomas became a writer. He had always been the one who felt things most deeply. Ruby recognized this, and instead of trying to moderate it the way schools and well-meaning adults often try to moderate sensitivity, treating it as a liability rather than an instrument, she handed him a better notebook and told him to write everything down. "The world needs people who can feel what other people feel and then put it in words," she told him. "That is not a small gift. Don't you dare apologize for it." She also taught them about their inheritance. Not the financial one, that was being handled by Patricia O'Shea slowly through the legal process, but the other inheritance, the one that their father had actually tried to give them and that Vivienne Marsh had tried to erase. She told them about Gerald Whitmore, not the billionaire, the boy from Kentucky, the man who drove himself to work 3 days a week because he hadn't forgotten what it felt like to work. The man who had built something real from nothing, not because he was special, but because he was relentless, and because he understood that the distance between where you are and where you want to be is made of days, and days are made of choices, and choices are made of who you decide to be. She had researched their father before she took them in. This was not accidental. Ruby Collins did not do accidental. "Your father," she told them once when Thomas was 12 and asking questions that had no good answers, "was a man who knew where he came from and never pretended he didn't. That is a rare thing, and it is in you, all 3 of you. I see it every day." Thomas wrote this down in his notebook. He still has the notebook. While Ruby raised those 3 boys, Patricia O'Shea worked. What she found over 4 years of careful investigation and legal maneuvering was worse than anyone had suspected. The asset transfers were the beginning. Gerald Whitmore had, in the 2 years before his death, signed over to Vivienne in transactions that would later be characterized by a forensic accountant as structurally coercive, property deeds worth approximately $12 million, investment accounts totaling another $8 million, and a significant personal stake in Whitmore Construction, representing roughly 15% of the company's total value. This had been done, as Patricia's investigation established, through a combination of document manipulation, deliberate timing, and what the forensic psychologist Patricia consulted described as sustained emotional exploitation of a grieving person. But the financial crime, as enormous as it was not the worst of what Patricia found. What Patricia found in the 4th year of her investigation, through a contact at the county medical examiner's office who had developed independently some of the same questions that Patricia had, was a toxicology report. A toxicology report that had existed since the week of Gerald's death and that had been, through a series of procedural failures and what appeared to be at least one deliberate obstruction, never properly reviewed. The report showed elevated levels of a cardiac glycoside compound in Gerald's system at the time of his death. Cardiac glycoside compounds, in low doses and under medical supervision, are used therapeutically. In elevated doses, administered to a person without their knowledge over a period of weeks, they cause cardiac arrest. They cause, in other words, exactly what Gerald Whitmore had died of. Patricia O'Shea drove to Millhaven on a Friday evening and sat at Ruby's kitchen table and told the 3 boys, James was 18 by now, Robert was 16, Thomas was 14, what she had found. The silence that followed was the silence of 3 people absorbing information that simultaneously answered everything and cost everything. James sat completely still. Robert looked at his hands. Thomas, who felt everything, did not cry. He had gone, Patricia later said, to somewhere inside himself that was too deep for tears. Then James looked at Patricia and asked the question that mattered. "What do we do?" And Patricia said, "We do everything,
and we do it right, and it takes as long as it takes.
Between 2003 and 2025, a great deal happened. James Whitmore graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in law. He was not merely a good student, he was the kind of student that professors remembered decades later. Precise, relentless, with an instinct for the structural truth beneath the surface of any argument. He went on to a prestigious law firm in Columbus where he spent 7 years, becoming, quietly and without fanfare, one of the most skilled financial crime and estate litigation attorneys in the state. He was, the entire time, building toward one specific moment. Robert Whitmore received an engineering scholarship, the result of a portfolio of independent projects that caught the attention of a Carnegie Mellon recruiter in a way that such things rarely happen outside of movies, except that Robert's portfolio was genuinely that extraordinary. He graduated with a degree in structural and mechanical engineering, worked for 5 years with a major infrastructure firm, and then did something that surprised everyone who had watched his career with conventional expectations. He left the firm and started his own company. The company was called Rebuild. Its focus was the renovation and structural improvement of underserved communities, affordable housing rehabilitation, community infrastructure, the practical application of serious engineering to places where serious engineering had never been applied because the people who lived there were not the people the industry was designed to serve. Within 4 years, Rebuild had projects in 11 states and had been profiled in 3 national publications and had won 2 government contracts and had received from a major impact investment firm a capital injection of $20 million. Robert was 32 years old. Thomas Whitmore became a writer. Not immediately. He took the long way around. A degree in English literature, then journalism, then a decade of working as a reporter for a regional newspaper in Cleveland, where he covered, among other things, financial crime, estate fraud, and the particular ways that wealth is transferred from the people who built it to the people who positioned themselves to take it. He wrote with the precision of someone who had studied at Ruby's table for years and the feeling of someone who had been paying attention with his whole body since he was 8 years old. His first book, published in 2021 when he was 28, was about financial predation targeting grieving families. It was dedicated to 2 people, Gerald Whitmore and Ruby Mae Collins. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 11 weeks. Through all of these years, the degrees, the careers, the building of lives, the 3 of them came back to the house on the creek as often as they could. Ruby was aging. She was in her 70s now, still sharp, still tending her garden, still conducting the table when all 3 of them were home, which was every Thanksgiving and every summer and as many weekends as adult lives allowed. She never asked them for anything. She never referenced what she had done for them in any way that suggested she was keeping a ledger. When James had tried, in his first year of earning a real salary, to give her a check that reflected some portion of what she had spent on them over the years, she had looked at the check and then looked at him and said, "I didn't raise you to pay me back. I raised you to go do what you're supposed to do. So go do it." She handed the check back. He invested it instead into a fund he established in her name, quietly, without telling her. It would become important later. Vivienne Marsh Whitmore had, in the years since she expelled 3 boys from their father's house, lived well. She had converted the Whitmore assets into a comfortable life, a renovated house in a wealthy Columbus suburb, investments that generated reliable income, a social circle that knew her as a wealthy widow and asked no particular questions about the origin of the wealth. She had been careful. She had been quiet. She had, in the years since Patricia O'Sea had begun her investigation, employed 2 attorneys of her own who had been effective at slowing the legal process to a pace that felt, at times, almost geological. She had also, in 2019, made a mistake. The mistake was that she sold a piece of property, a commercial property in Millhaven that had been part of Gerald's original holdings, to a development company without realizing that the development company's primary legal counsel was a firm whose senior partner had, 7 years earlier, been a mentee of Patricia O'Sea. The transactions surfaced documents. The documents connected to other documents. The other documents connected to the toxicology report that had been buried for 16 years. By 2022, the investigation that Patricia had been quietly building for 19 years had accumulated enough to move. The Ohio Attorney General's office, presented with Patricia's files, opened a formal criminal investigation. The financial fraud charges alone, the asset transfers, the forged signatures on 2 key documents, the manipulation of estate proceedings, were substantial. The toxicology evidence was more substantial. Vivienne Marsh Whitmore was arrested on a Thursday morning in March 2023. She was charged with financial fraud, estate manipulation, and, after the toxicology evidence was reviewed by 3 independent experts who reached identical conclusions, first-degree murder. The trial lasted 4 months. James sat in the courtroom for every single day of it. Not as the attorney, Patricia O'Shea handled that with a team that included 2 of the best prosecutors in the state. James sat in the gallery. He sat still, the way he had always been still, with the stillness that Ruby had helped him understand was not rigidity, but rootedness. He was there as a witness, as the oldest son, as the person who had said at 14, "That is not what our father wanted," and who had spent 20 years making sure that statement was eventually heard by the right people. Vivienne Marsh Whitmore was convicted on all counts in February 2024. She was sentenced to 22 years. The town of Millhaven, Ohio, had changed in 22 years. Not dramatically, small Ohio towns do not change dramatically, but in the particular way of places that have been slowly declining. Storefronts that used to be businesses were now empty. The downtown had a hollowed quality. The tax base had eroded as younger people left for cities that seemed to have more to offer. James, Robert, and Thomas came about in June 2025. Not quietly. James had incorporated a legal foundation, the Whitmore Family Foundation, whose stated purpose was the support of families affected by estate fraud, financial predation, and the legal vulnerabilities of the grieving. Its endowment, drawn from the assets recovered through the civil litigation that ran parallel to the criminal case, was $41 million. From a man who built $68 million from nothing and whose sons had been left with a cracked photograph and 2 cans of baked beans. The first thing the foundation did in Millhaven was purchase the downtown block of vacant storefronts, all 12 of them. Robert's company, Rebuild, began work immediately. Not luxury development, not gentrification, the specific, thoughtful renovation of a main street for the actual people who lived there. A medical clinic, an after-school learning center, affordable commercial space for local businesses, a community hall. The second thing James did was establish a scholarship fund through the Millhaven School District, full 4-year scholarships, 10 per year, for students with low-income families. The scholarship criteria did not mention grades as the primary qualification. The primary qualification was, at James's insistence, for reasons the committee did not initially understand, demonstrated curiosity. Evidence that the student was the kind of person who looked at things carefully and asked why. The kind of person who noticed. The third thing, and this was Thomas's contribution, and it was the one that the town talked about longest, was a community library renovation. The Millhaven Public Library, where 3 boys had sat on the steps for 11 hours in September 2003, received a complete interior renovation, a doubled book collection, a digital resource center, and a new wing that was named over Ruby's loud and extended protests, the Ruby Mae Collins Reading Room. The dedication ceremony was on a Saturday in August 2025. The whole town came.
Ruby Collins was 83 years old. She'd been told about the library wing 3 weeks before the ceremony, when it was too late to stop it, which James had calculated precisely because he knew his mother in every way that mattered, well enough to know that telling her earlier would have resulted in a sustained and formidable campaign to have her name removed. She sat in the front row of the ceremony in a yellow dress that Thomas had bought for her, and a hat that she had bought herself, and she received what the town gave her: the standing ovation, the speeches, the moment when the curtain came off the sign above the new wing, with the expression of a woman who is genuinely moved and genuinely embarrassed in equal measure. James spoke first. He was 36 years old,
standing at a podium in the town where he had sat on library steps at 14 with nowhere to go. And he was steady in the way he had always been steady. The rootedness rather than rigidity. The stillness that meant he was fully present rather than braced. He said, 22 years ago, a woman came out of this building with a stack of books and found 3 boys who had nothing. She asked one question. She didn't ask where we came from or what had happened or what our situation was. She asked when we had last eaten. And then she fed us. And then she gave us everything else. He paused. What she gave us was not money. She didn't have money to give. What she gave us was the thing that everything else is made of. She gave us the belief, not the idea, not the concept, but the bone-deep lived experience that we were worth something, that we were worth feeding, worth sheltering, worth teaching, worth the time it takes to sit at a table every evening and ask a person what they think, and then actually listen to the answer. Another pause. My father built $68 million from nothing. That is not a small thing. But Ruby Collins built 3 human beings from the wreckage of what happened to us. And I would like someone to tell me which one is worth more. The town was quiet. Then Thomas spoke. Thomas Whitmore, who had been the 10-year-old with the antenna, the one who felt everything, who had written in a notebook since he was 8 years old because he understood that the things that matter most disappear without warning, stood up and did not use notes. He talked about the night Ruby had made them rice and stew. He talked about the nightmares and the kitchen and the tea that was already made. He talked about the notebook and what Ruby had told him about his gift for feeling things. Don't you dare apologize for it. He talked about his father, not the businessman, the man. The boy from Kentucky who drove himself to work 3 days a week, who had tried to give his son something real and had been robbed of the chance to finish. My father built things, Thomas said. Ruby built us. And we built this. Not for ourselves, not for our names on buildings, not to prove anything to a town that mostly forgot we existed. We built this because a woman sat with us in the dark when we were afraid, and there was no other help. And we have spent 22 years trying to figure out how to be worth what she saw in us that Thursday evening. He looked at Ruby. I don't know if we are yet, he said, but we're still working on it. The house by the creek still stands. Ruby Collins still lives in it. She tends her garden with the same precision she has always brought to it, though she lets Robert help now, which is a concession that those who know her understand to be significant. The kitchen table is the same table, the one where the table happened. The nightly conversations, the questions, the gentle and relentless pushing toward clarity. It is scratched and solid and has been in that kitchen for 40 years, and Ruby has declined, with great firmness, every offer to replace it. On the wall above it, there is now a framed photograph. It was taken at the library dedication ceremony. In it, Ruby is seated in her yellow dress and her hat, and James is on her left and Robert is on her right, and Thomas is crouching in front of her with his hand on her knee, and they are all looking at the camera. The Ruby is the only one not smiling. She is looking at the 3 of them with an expression that anyone who has ever loved someone they helped become will recognize immediately. It is not pride. Pride is too simple for what that expression is. It is something closer to recognition. The expression of a person who saw something in 3 hungry boys on a library step, something that the world had decided to walk past, and said, I see it. I know what that is, and I am not walking past it. James found her in the kitchen one morning, a few weeks after the ceremony, standing at the window looking out at the garden the way she sometimes did. He stood beside her. After a while, he said, "Was it worth it? All those years? Everything you gave up?" Ruby Collins looked at her garden for a long moment. Then she said, "Gerald Whitmore built $68 million. You know what he started with?" "Nothing," James said. "Not nothing," Ruby said. "A truck and a belief that what he built with his hands was worth something." She looked at him. "I started with a kitchen table and 3 hungry boys. Don't you tell me that was nothing." James put his arm around her. Outside, the creek ran on the way it had always run, steady, unhurried, indifferent to the decades of human drama on its banks. The garden was in full August bloom. Somewhere in the house, Thomas was writing. Somewhere across town, Robert's construction crew was working. The town was waking up. And in a yellow house by the creek, a woman who had started with a kitchen table looked at what she had built with it and did not say a word because there was nothing left to say. There is a question this story asks, quietly underneath everything else. It is not the question about Vivienne Marsh or the justice that eventually came, or the $41 million recovered from a woman who thought she had gotten away with everything. Those things matter. Justice matters. The law, when it finally works the way it's supposed to, matters. But the question this story actually asks is a different one. It asks, what is a person worth? Not in money, not in assets or credentials or what they can prove on paper. What is a person worth when they have nothing? When they are sitting on library steps at the end of a day that nobody stopped to ask about? When the world has looked at them and made its calculation and kept walking? Gerald Whitmore knew the answer once. He had lived it. The boy from Kentucky who was worth something before anyone agreed to pay him for it. Ruby Collins knew it the moment she stopped. And 3 boys who had been reduced by loss and cruelty and the particular violence of people who weaponize grief to 1 backpack and a cracked photograph, those 3 boys carried the answer inside them through everything that happened because a woman had fed them and sat with them in the dark and asked them every evening what they thought and had listened to the answers. The world is full of people sitting on steps. The world is also full of people who walk past. And then, not often enough, but often enough to matter, is someone who stops, asks one question, and changes everything.